Next, from Springfield, we sit down with Rob Carr, the president and CEO of the Illinois Retail Merchants Association, as he explains why his association and other retailers oppose increasing the retail theft felony threshold. This runs about 15 minutes.
Rob Carr, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Recently, we covered a press conference. We wanted to explore the ideas a little bit more. You were talking about a proposal by Chris Welch in the House to raise the level of when is theft, shoplifting, the dollar amount that becomes a felony.
Right.
And as I understand it, it's currently, what, $300?
It's currently $300 for retail theft, right? It's actually, there's a number of proposals, but Representative L.G. Sims and Representative Jason Slaughter have two proposals that are the central focus.
Primary ones.
Right.
And what would their bill, if that passed, where would that raise the level which constitutes a felony?
Well, Representative Slaughter's bill wants to take it to $2,500. So you could steal under $2,500 repeatedly and never be charged with a felony.
And it would be what, a misdemeanor, I guess?
It'd be a misdemeanor, right. Under the initial proposal that Representative Sims has been working on within the broader context of criminal justice reform, it's $2,000.
And their argument would be some of these people who are shoplifting are kids in high school or younger people. And once they get a felony conviction on their record, then it can ruin their life, because who wants to hire someone with a felony conviction? They may be prohibited from even applying for any number of jobs, because if it's in law enforcement or something and you have a felony conviction, they're not even going to consider you. A, are you sympathetic to that argument, and what's wrong with it if you think it's wrong?
We are sympathetic to the fact that kids make mistakes. There's no question about that. I think retailers in general are sympathetic to that effect, particularly if the parent or the guardian shows some responsibility as well, and some reaction that the youth in question has done something they should not have done. But we have also worked with advocates over a number of years to have diversion programs, to change the laws for ban the box so that those who have criminal convictions like this do not have to disclose them. We've worked with them on expungement and sealing. So IRMA, for almost the better part of a decade now, was for a long time the only business group engaging in those types of issues. Others have now started to, but we were early on in that process, and we continue to work with them on expungement and sealing type approaches.
At the $300 level, do we know how much retail theft, what's the total amount roughly? I'm sure it's somewhat of a guess, but... It's
a little bit of a guess, but we're running right in the neighborhood of $2 billion right now a year for Illinois. So you're losing somewhere in the neighborhood of $90 million in state sales taxes, another $20 million or so in locally imposed sales taxes, and I shouldn't say locally imposed, the state share of or the local share of the sales taxes. It's additional money if you calculate in if you have any locally imposed states or locally imposed sales taxes by the local unit of government. So it has a hit not only to the retailer, who can't recover their costs, because every item that walks out is something upon which we can't recover our costs to pay employees, property taxes, rent, to purchase the new products to replace the ones that have been purchased or stolen. It impacts local government's ability to provide services because they're out the sales taxes we just talked about, states out money. So it has a ripple effect. It is not a victimless crime.
And something, people who maybe haven't ever been in business don't appreciate, the vast majority of the retailers' costs, of a sale, let's say, they don't make money on that. So I think you had said previously that the average profit margin for retail is about 2%, is it?
In our last survey, which is a couple of years old, it was about 2%, right? But that sounds like a lot to some, but it depends what sector you're in. Electronics runs with a little higher profit margin, but they also run with a much higher cost carrying margin. In other words, the inventory they have to carry costs a whole lot more to carry than, for example, a grocer. But a grocer runs at about zero these days. So it's a little bit over the board, but 2% was the average.
So for every dollar, the retailer gets to keep 2 cents, and for the 2 cents, that's what he has left after he's paid salaries and utilities and taxes on the property and everything else.
Right.
So if I steal $100 worth of product out of a store, that's going to eat up like $1,000 or you know,
No, it's cutting into, your
it's
point
going
is
to
it's cutting
eat
into
up
the narrow margin.
$1,000 worth of sales just
Yeah.
for you to for that $100 of loss,
Right.
right?
It's cutting it in there. It's making it harder to make that margin.
My math may be off a bit, but it's...
No, but your point is correct. It makes it
the
harder.
point is that people don't appreciate. It's not just that you're losing $100, it's that or $300, it's that you're losing thousands of dollars worth of sales, the profits on sales. You just wipe that out with a few $100 being stolen.
Yeah, because it has a ripple effect. You have to make more than, or you have to sell more of whatever is left to sell. And so it does have that ripple effect. The proponents also talk about need, that the theory is that much of the theft is for need. And that's simply not true. They also, what's really driving the whole debate, not only for retail theft but for criminal justice reform, is the prison population in Illinois, the desire to reduce it, and there is a bipartisan desire to reduce it. And reduce the costs associated with that, and the theory that prison ought to be reserved for those who are violent. We would generally agree with that, but I don't know that it should be exclusively for violent.
Have you had any discussion with the bill sponsors as to some middle ground, and if what middle ground is there?
Yeah, we have been talking with particularly Representative L.G. Sims, who's also chairman of the House Judiciary Criminal Committee, about the proposals, and we've had very productive discussions with him. We're looking at some alternatives to raising it, and we've been able to provide a lot of fact-based information that has completely countered the recommendations and some of the theory that was put out, for example, by the Sentencing Commission. And we can talk about that if you'd like, but in terms of retail theft numbers, whether they're rising or falling, and who's really in prison and who's not, and what they're in prison for and what they're not in prison for.
I should mention L.G. Sims is a former police officer, so it's not as if he's unfamiliar with criminal activity.
Right, and he's a relative, an attorney as well, so he is not. And we've had very productive discussions. I've known L.G. a long time.
What about those who would say, you know, why don't you, as retailers, just make it more difficult for people to steal?
Yeah, it's a great, they do. They invest a lot in loss prevention techniques. But criminals are endlessly creative. It's a lot of reaction, right? You try to anticipate what they're going to do, but it's hard to anticipate the criminal mind because a lot of people aren't wired that way. They don't think in that fashion, in that creative fashion. But they invest a ton of money in those types of efforts to stop retail theft.
Has it had an impact?
Oh, sure, it has an impact.
I mean, can we measure that the average sales stolen has gone down at all? Or?
No, because it's actually the retail theft numbers are actually increasing. So we've had other states around the nation have increased their felony thresholds over the last 5 years. And as they've done that, according to the FBI, retail theft has risen 17%, almost 18%, and the value of the merchandise has risen 30%. So the thieves are stealing more, and they're stealing to the threshold.
So now it's not a pair of blue jeans; they're going for the,
whatever they can,
whatever more expensive piece of something,
or more of the blue jeans, or that's a perfect segue into the whole theory of the need. The items that are most commonly stolen are not need-based items. High-end vacuum cleaners, for example.
They're what, reselling them on online or something themselves?
Resell them, take them to a fence. As somebody who specializes, another criminal who specializes in handling stolen merchandise. There's a return fraud as well. They print out fraudulent UPC symbols, those scanner codes that every product has, and they'll steal a high-end, let's say, vacuum cleaner that costs $400, and they'll put a UPC symbol on it that says it cost $700. They'll return it at a different store. They've pocketed, not only the $400 but the additional $300, and so there's a variety of ways in which they do this. But the interesting fact is that over 80% of the retail thieves who are caught have the money on them to purchase the product, so they're clearly not stealing for need.
When as you said, it went up 17%. Where does Illinois, with a $300 threshold, do you know how we compare with other states?
We have one of the lowest retail felony thresholds. Not the lowest, I don't think, but we're one of the lowest. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, though, in that circumstance, right? I think it sends an appropriate signal. We are a centrally located state. That is, we have a lot of borders, so it's easy to get to us. We have organized retail crime, which is a hyper version of retail theft. And we know that Illinois is often a targeted state for organized retail crime. You have gangs that literally roam from state to state, store to store, stealing a lot of merchandise. They go in and sweep shelves, essentially, is what they do. So it's not inappropriate for Illinois to be higher, or to have that lower threshold.
Has anyone looked at, on the assigning, which is all this is about, the felony level, instead of making it on the amount of money being sold, has anyone discussed maybe it's a misdemeanor the first time, but if it's a second theft, then it becomes a felony?
We're talking about different approaches with the sponsor that might do that.
Somebody might do something stupid once, right?
Correct.
And with the put up to it by high school, a dare or something, but...
They might, but I think we have to be fair to our state's attorneys as well. They've done a pretty good job of determining who's really in that position and who's not. And the simple fact is that the stats would show us, it would indicate that those who are in prison for retail theft aren't there just for retail theft. I mean, according to the Sentencing Commission's own numbers, the typical thief that's in prison has 7 prior felony convictions and 13 prior misdemeanors. Now, the retail theft may be the recent trigger that put them in prison, but it is not because of retail theft. It is because they have these other priors, or they are currently under probation for a prior, is what put them there.
Where does this legislation stand at this point?
It's on second reading in the House for more discussion. The sponsor made that clear. He'd be coming back to his own committee with additional tweaks, because it's not just retail theft they're looking at. It's lowering felony thresholds across the board and other changes they want to make to try to lower the impact at the state level. But they have to be careful, because when California did this, California raised their threshold to $950. They had to come back $950. The California Assembly had to come back a year later and appropriate over $270 million to local government, because it just shifted the burden to local governments. So while it accomplished what California wanted on the state level and helped with their budget, it severely impacted the locals, which is why you referenced the press conference that initiated this interview. We had the Sheriff's Association standing with us and the Illinois Municipal League standing with us, because they get it not only from the experience in other states.
That they're going to lose.
Correct.
Right. And the other people that are going to lose are the legal shoppers, right? Because won't prices have to be increased to offset the losses?
Well, yeah, but there's a limit to how much you can do that as well, because
you're
of
competing, I
competition.
guess, online.
You're competing online. You're competing with other brick and mortars.
Which is the big, obviously Amazon is changing the whole world of retail, and one would think, unless it's organized crime behind the scenes, because of the nature of the way you shop with Amazon, they're not going to be facing retail theft.
Well, they're actually facing something a little different, and it's just starting to show up in a significant fashion. And it's you can argue about whether they're stealing from Amazon or the customer, but if a package is left on your porch, there's a spike now occurring in the number of reported thefts of that kind, where UPS, FedEx, someone has left a package on your porch, and your neighbor or a bypassing someone is swiping the package. They may not even know what's in it, but they know it's something.
As we sit here today, and speaking of Amazon, and we look around at different stores, the long and short of it is, with technology, this is probably the most challenging time of retail at all. I mean, here we have Sears Roebuck, which was the king of retail for decades, and now they're struggling to survive. So this all comes in the context of that environment where the local retail stores, which is still convenient for someone just to be able to go out and grab something right away. Maybe if they forget a birthday, you don't have time to wait for 3 days or something for an Amazon delivery. What do you hear from your retail members, large and small, about the environment in which they're trying to survive and compete, just in general, and obviously then any other losses are going to be even that much more damaging?
Sure. Well, that's what frustrates them, right? So retailers are your tip of the spear entrepreneurs, right? They're eternally optimistic generally about or they wouldn't get into the business, because it's a tough business in retail, whether it's a restaurant or a grocery store or whatever it might be. It is a tough business. But they're eternally optimistic. But they face tremendous challenges, some of which you mentioned. Not only are they competing with federal brick and mortar, they're competing with surrounding states, all of whom have lower cost impacts than does Illinois across the board. 2/3 of Illinois' population lives within a 40-minute drive of a border, so it's not hard for Illinois consumers to shop elsewhere, and we know that they do. But then they have the e-commerce impact as well. And you have the state of Illinois, which has a terrible fiscal situation. You have many municipalities around the state which have put themselves in terrible fiscal situations, particularly the city of Chicago and the county of Cook, which are significant players, both economically and population-wise for the state of Illinois. And then you have artificial mandates being put on, like $15 minimum wages, and then they want to hang what we would argue is an open for stealing sign around the neck of retailers by increasing the felony theft threshold to $2,000 or higher. It doesn't matter what you increase it to, it is sending a terrible signal to your brick and mortar retailers who are struggling to survive.
And lastly, should this make it out of the legislature, do we know where the governor is on this bill?
We do not know. He is generally inclined to, obviously I can't speak for him, but he is generally inclined to want to engage in criminal justice reform. It is his sentencing commission that produced a long list of recommendations, one of which was a recommendation to increase the felony theft threshold. Now, that did not receive a unanimous vote, and we have pointed out it was based on some flawed comparisons. For example, they talked about larceny. Well, larceny is a catch-all. We talk about retail theft numbers. So there's a difference in some of the facts they're using. I think he's inclined. Whether he would how we might act on something, I think we have to determine what ultimately gets to his desk.
Well, we'll continue to follow it, and Rob Carr, we appreciate you talking with us about it.
Always enjoy. Thank you.
Thanks.